Hi friends, David here from Above AVL and Learn Stage Audio. And in this video, we're going to talk about what actually matters when you're buying a PA speaker. We're going to talk about some things that you can measure and read off a spec sheet. We're going to talk about some things that you can't measure and absolutely cannot read off a spec sheet. And last but not least, we're going to tell you if this speaker, which at the time of this recording is 50% of the cost of this speaker, actually sounds any different. Let's dive in. All right. So the crazy thing about speakers, especially powered speakers, but even passive ones as well too, is that over the last 10 to 15 years, they've all grown in leaps and bounds in terms of sound quality. And the cool thing about that is that everything sounds better. It's easier to make things sound good. They feed back less and they generally perform better and are lighter in general than they used to be. The downside is when you're comparing multiple speakers, it becomes really, really difficult to tell what actually matters. So today we want to play a little bit of Mythbusters, talk about what actually matters, what doesn't, and how to decide. To give a little context, this is a Yamaha DXR10 Mark II, and this is a Yamaha DBR10. The biggest difference between the two of these is that they're different ranges of powered speakers from Yamaha, and they both have kind of a passive counterpart in the passive line as well. Okay, or pretty close. In terms of physical, there's going to be a lot of things similar and a couple things different. Okay, so let's start by looking at the front. So these are both obviously 10-inch speakers, but there's a 12, there's a 15 within these two lines. When you buy something that's twice the price, the DXR, you get a better handle, okay? It's an actual full handle instead of just a slide in your hand kind of handle in terms of back panel layout and ease of use. You're gonna find that, for example, they're really very, very similar. The DXR is a fan, but it's really not noisy or anything like that. It's fine. Other than that, it's like, okay, you've got two inputs, right? On the DXR, I guess you technically have a third, which is an RCA. The DBR, you've only got two. The second has the RCA, which is stereo, so it's kind of confusing, but it's fine. You've got some different switches. So you've got the contour modes, which basically means that it's a DSP preset that EQs the box for you, and then a selectable high pass filter as well, which you can use to select what you want depending on the type of sound you're going for, depending on if you're using with a sub, without, etc. Now you got power switches, power inputs via IEC, pretty straightforward, very similar on the back. Okay, one place that you're gonna see differences between different boxes is gonna be on the bottom. Okay, our DBR here, if we can see it, has one tripod mount on a speaker. The DXR, however, has two, and hopefully you can see that. There we go, we can see that in camera too. So it has two, okay? Why two tripod holes? Well, two tripod holes means that one of them is the typical straight up tripod hole. The other is a tilt down. I like to, if it's within your means, it's almost always best to get one that tilts down, okay? Because usually they're about a 7.5-degree angle, and it just allows you to, instead of having sound coming out of this horn and it being symmetrical up and down, it tilts it down so that you're not throwing sound into the ceiling and into spaces that are typically echoey. You're focusing it on the audience a little bit more. Okay, so that's always going to help you out. I recommend going with that as much as possible. What else? You want to look at speakers from the physical end and talk about, okay, do they have the ability, for example, to be a stage monitor, right? Can I either tilt them back or, in the case of many speakers, tilt them sideways? Okay, when I do that, what's the angle of the sound coming out as, right? Is it coming out, for example, some cheaper speakers have like a 90 by 20 or 90 by 30 horn on them. And the issue with that, with the high frequency horn being a 90 by a really tight angle, is that when you turn it sideways for a monitor, now it's 90 kind of vertically, right? Where you actually probably in a stage monitor, you don't need a lot of vertical. And then it's super narrow horizontally. It's only 20 or 30 degrees. So your musician can easily step out of it. Okay, so that's something to look out for. Um, in the case of these speakers, they're both kind of in that mid-range in a pretty good spot where they can work as a monitor pretty well. You can put the EQ into a monitor for the back, which is just going to roll off the low end because it's on the ground, and you'll be off to the races. So let's talk about spec sheet differences and how they matter. Okay, so there's going to be a few really key differences between the two in a spec sheet perspective. So let's hop over to the computer and dive into that. So I don't want to overwhelm you with what's on the screen here, and we'll show you the screen, but I've got the DBR series speakers on the left and the DXR on the right to compare the two. Now, like I said, between the 10-inch models at the time of this recording, they're about 50% different. The DXR is about 50% more than the DBR. Okay, and once we look at the specs, we're going to hop back and talk about how they actually sound because I've been listening to them for about a month and put them through their paces. Okay, so as I was just mentioning, these are both 90 by 60 degree horns. So we really like that because when you turn them on their side as a monitor, they're still going to perform well because now they're going to be 60 degree wide by 90 high. Again, more vertical coverage than I want in a monitor, but not bad for a dual purpose box. If you're really getting into a professional side of things and you want to go with a dedicated monitor, it's generally going to have a better horn or a rotatable horn to be able to get that in the right place. Okay, next we'll go ahead and we'll look at the components section. So this tells us the size of the drivers, all that jazz. And the biggest thing with the size of drivers and all that jazz and the crossover, etc., is from looking at a spec sheet, this tells you nothing. Okay. There are things that tend to happen, like for example, larger diaphragms on your horn, larger voice coils on your sub or your low frequency driver tend to sound better and cover a wider range of frequencies. I say tend to because it's just not something that is 100% reliable. It's a trend, it's a, correlation, but it's not always true. And so these are nice to have, but they don't really actually tell you anything. Same with power, okay? Power by itself doesn't tell you anything in a spec sheet. The first reason is that watts could be peak, could be RMS, could be program. All of these are different ways of measuring it. And, some manufacturers will tell you, like, for example, continuous Yamaha has, so that's like an RMS value. That's good to know. But other brands will say peak, and peak often is super inflated, like it's a really high number, but you're not going to get it all the time. But regardless, wattage in itself is not that helpful. Now, when we pair wattage with sensitivity, we can calculate the maximum loudness of that speaker. Okay, so maximum output level or sensitivity, as a lot of manufacturers call it. This matters. So this is when you take 1 watt or 2.83 volts, you feed it into the speaker, and you measure the output in a acoustic chamber at 1 meter. Okay, and so this is beautiful because this actually tells you how loud the speaker can get. Because you can then mathematically figure out, and there's plenty of online calculators, we'll probably make some at some point, that will walk you through that. But for the difference is you can look at two speakers like the DBR10 and the DXR10, and we say, okay, the DXR10 is actually 3 dB louder than the DBR10, which is actually a doubling of acoustical energy. Hopefully I didn't mess up that fact there. Um, or else the people in the comments will yell at me. But it's actually a decent amount more. A 3 dB is actually a good bit more energy. Okay. What else do we have? You want to know about if it's fan cooled or not? I mean, it can matter. Fan cooled speakers can be really quiet these days, though, so it's not a huge issue. And then you're going to get the size. Size matters. But ultimately, you're going to have these specs And then you're gonna have a frequency chart. So a lot of times you can go in the download section, and I know kind of hides in here. Here we go, tech specs. So we open those guys up. And so if we look at the two, we're gonna get some specs. Frequency response, I'm gonna be honest with you, if you compare them, and I think they have them for the DBR series, but it's not on this document. Frequency response, there it is. So you're gonna have some charts such as frequency response. I'm gonna be honest with you, almost any process speaker is going to look really flat in terms of frequency response. And a lot of times, they're not gonna tell you a lot about what's going on. Now, the polar plots can be really helpful. So what the polar plots tell you is how directed the audio is. And, it might be hard to see, so we'll scroll in, but we'll just look at this horizontal between the DBR10 and the DXR10, the two speakers we have here. And we see that they're not massively different, but there is some difference to them where the DXR has a little bit better control, particularly on the backside. So less sound is leaking out in the wrong direction. When you step out of the zone of coverage, it really starts to fall off. Okay, and so let's go back to our speakers and talk about a few of these differences and the difference in sound quality between them and how in the world you figure out what's right for you. All right, so we're back at our speakers, and there's a lot of things on spec sheets that honestly don't really cause one speaker to be better than another or anything like that. So, how do you tell what's right for you? I'm going to be honest. It's not always easy. If you can get in front of the speakers yourself, find somebody who has them, that's a great option. Otherwise, you just kind of got to listen to the people that you trust that are recommending them to you, like us at Above AVL. So, just as an example, I have been switching out these two speakers as for listening to music, using mics through it, testing them on live audio for about a month, switching between the two. Okay. And they're both good sounding speakers. They both cover the frequency range, they both amplify everything. But what spec sheets don't tell you is how they actually sound. Okay. Now, again, going back 15 years or more, I've listened to a lot of speakers, and these are both good sounding speakers. But the things you can't see on a spec sheet are that side by side switching between them, same songs, same microphones, etc. The sound that comes out of a nicer speaker like this DXR is is more lifelike. There's more depth to it. Different sources that I mix together have more separation to them and kind of blur together a little bit less. And these are the things that unfortunately a spec sheet can't tell you. And that's where you for audio, kind of got to trust the person who's recommending it to you. There's not really a way around it. And that's where, it can be hard, especially between different brands, to go spec sheet to spec sheet to spec sheet to spec sheet, because probably the most important factor in a speaker is how does it sound? And that factor just unfortunately isn't going to show up on a spec sheet. Everybody's frequency response these days looks very flat, but how it sounds and how it amplifies things is a little bit more nuanced and honestly takes somebody listening to it. And that's why at Above AVL, we specialize in having actually listened to this stuff, pay attention to all the brands on the market, try to get experience listening to as much of it as we can so that we can give you the best choice. Okay, so I hope that helped you really be able to tell the differences between some of these speakers. There's always going to be other spec sheet things like rigging points, hanging ability, etc. But, the basic things are make sure it's loud enough for your purposes, and we can help you with that at aboveavl.com. And then ultimately balancing the difference between, having a little bit of extra quality in the sound versus cost, right? Like hands down all day long, the DXR from Yamaha and the DXS, the series above it, are really incredible sounding speakers. And if you can swing them, you're going to thank yourself for years to come because Yamaha's powered speakers have a really awesome warranty on them. I think it's a 7-year. Something like the DBR is A workhorse. It's a really fine speaker. It sounds quite good, but it doesn't sound as lifelike. It doesn't sound quite as clear as something like this. Both good speakers. So if you're looking between these speakers or others, head over to aboveavl.com. Feel free to compare, but the best thing to do when you're looking to purchase is just fill out our contact form or add some speakers to your cart and request a quote through our site. We love to help you find the very best in speakers, help you get exactly what you need, all the parts and pieces, and make it a working system so that you can get back to making great events. If that sounds good, then thank you so much for watching. Head over to aboveavl.com and we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.